Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action on all things to do with sustainability. With me, Nigel Lake, here at New Lab in Brooklyn today, and with my co-host Paul Herman in France, somewhere in France, I'm not sure where he is. We're going to be joined a little bit later by Julie Kane and Rick Rakowski from Democracy Investments to talk about what is happening to democracy, not just in the US, but around the world. There are many dark forces at work and many things that we, I think, are all rightly concerned about. But before that, we are going to dive into our regular Green Jobs Report with Paul Herman, Fadhel Kaboub, and Amir Khaleghi. So, Paul, over to you.
Welcome, everybody, to ESGX Live. Thanks for joining us today. And feel free to let your friends know about ESGX Live. We are streaming here on YouTube, and we have a live audience inside Zoom. So today we're going to talk about democracy under pressure. It's a little less under pressure in the US a week later after the US midterms. But we also have some missiles flying from Russia to the Ukraine, which are spilling over into countries like Poland and Moldova. So democracy remains under pressure globally. So we're going to dig into that with our guest panelists, Julie Kane and Rick Rakowski of Democracy Investments. As we do monthly, we're going to cover the Green Jobs Report and also talk about labor force participation globally as well. So I'm going to welcome Amir Khaleghi, who's a soon-to-be PhD in 2023, from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, a HIP investor analyst, and a fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Welcome, Amir. Tell us about the latest in green jobs.
Thank you. So exciting report this month, especially with our panel discussion. So as we begin, we always start with the monthly Green Jobs Report, which provides data-driven insights towards greening the economy. Our analysis is made possible through HIP Investor, specifically their human impact plus profit ratings for over 2,000 US rated companies. These companies, based on the metrics of health, wealth, earth, equality, trust, products and services, and management practices, are given an overall HIP rating. Higher HIP ratings indicate better performance or more socially acceptable performance, whereas lower ratings are known as extractive or net negative. So these US companies are all associated with specific industries, and we mapped them using the North American Industry Classification codes, which maps to the BLS data, specifically the Current Employment Statistics Survey, which provides data on employment and wages. Once mapped, we are able to come to an industry weighted or a weighted industry HIP rating, which is a combination between employment and 7 HIP metrics. And we can see some examples here in terms of the bucketing: green industries, slightly extractive, and extractive. Overall, we analyze over 180 industries within the US economy, and we can see some example industries below. Oops. Some example industries below. But, over the months, for those of you who have joined us, our analysis has shown that greener industries are more resilient and pay more. So while also being socially positive, they also, pay more and are more resilient to job loss. So this chart that we're looking at now is the cumulative percent difference from the February 2020 employment level. And we can see that green industries, one was the first to cross the threshold back to its February 2020 level. But we can see now that since the summer, around August, green jobs have stagnated in their growth, and slightly extractive industries have actually surpassed the proportional 2020 employment level, but we can still see how extractive industries are lagging behind slightly extractive and green industries here. But what does that entail, right? As we stagnate, are we really building back better towards a hipper economy? We can see here from this graph that unfortunately we are not. We saw a time period in 2020 where unemployment was lowering and we were actually building back towards a greener economy. But since March 2021, April 2021, we have been on a declining slope as unemployment lowers. This was the, oops. And we can see here, due to the stagnation of green jobs and a greater growth in slightly extractive and extractive jobs, that unfortunately the hipness of our economy is on the decline. Next, we can look at the the average pay for green industries in comparison to slightly extractive and extractive. And we can see a large differential between slightly extractive and green, and an even larger differential between extractive and green. So, you know, while also being socially positive, they are also paying the best average yearly rates. We can see across since January 2010, the growth of green industries, slightly extractive industries, and extractive industries in regard to wage. We saw that from 2010 to 2020, there was an average year-over-year growth of around 3%. But since March of 2020, we've been seeing a very large increase in terms of wage, where green industries are leading, but slightly extractive is a laggard. So, in terms of resiliency to job loss, we can see that green jobs have the lowest unemployment rate of 1.5%. Slightly extractive matches the economy unemployment rate of 3.5%, where extractive industries are around 5.8%. But, you know, as unemployment lowers, we should also talk about the labor force participation rates. We can see here a state view of the unemployment rates by state, and we can see that in the southeast quadrant that we actually have 2.4% or lower being in these lower buckets, as compared to, you know, Texas and even higher, you know, matching like the Midwest. But we can see that from the calculation of the unemployment rate, it has to do with labor force participation. So as individuals leave the labor force and choose not to participate in the labor force by like actively seeking a job, the result of that is lowering unemployment rates. And we can see here that although the lower quadrant, southeast quadrant, has very low unemployment rates, we can see that they also, have the lowest labor force participation. So that begs the question of why are individuals in the southeast corridor choosing not to participate in the labor force? And it, you know, it could be a product of older generation cycling out, but it also could be a product that the types of jobs that are available are not aligned with the individuals within those geographies. Then, you know, taking a worldview, we can see that, you know, the labor force participation varies across the globe, but the United States in terms of labor force participation is right around the median, whereas, you know, there's other countries that are, you know, much higher than the United States comparatively in terms of labor force participation. And hopefully within our discussion today, we can get a little deeper insight, you know, beyond labor force participation as well. I'm sure we will cover a plethora of topics.
Amir, this is great. Thanks for pulling this together. And I see you got this from the International Labor Organization. So it's interesting to look at like the Southeast United States and Mississippi with like a 55, 58% labor participation rate and how that might compare around the world. it's especially exciting to see someplace like Cambodia with a lot of young people with a 79% rate. So thanks for digging in. Thanks for showing off that green jobs have recovered faster during COVID. That green job growth is higher than extractive job growth. We do have one question, and then we'll kick off the panel. Can you tell anything about how extractive industry jobs have changed since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war earlier this year?
We did see a correlation with more extractive industries such as oil and gas extraction uptick to kind of combat gas prices and bringing more domestic production, but it really did fluctuate. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you look at past reports, I believe from 3 months ago, we did a deep dive in terms of the fluctuation in extractive industries. And we can actually look back. You can see these downticks in terms of like April in extractive industries, that the unemployment rate was greatly lowered, but there was very large fluctuations in terms of relative to demand. So as we saw gas prices lower, then there was a correlation with higher unemployment in these extractive industries.
And
good
to see. So you can see how the macro factors of war and energy prices can actually affect the job market as well. All right, well, let's go ahead. Last point.
Oh, and in terms of the growth of green industries, I think we also have to take a lens of what is the capacity of growth relative to investment. So in these types of geographies, you need infrastructure for these types of jobs to grow, and the greater majority is in favor of these types of greener, more socially sustainable investments. But what can be done from a democratic standpoint of providing an infrastructure for the growth of these socially sustainable jobs and industries?
All right, well, let's get into that with our expanded panel. So I want to welcome Julie Kane and Rick Rakowski of Democracy Investments. And Amir, thanks for your monthly Green Jobs report, super insightful. Julie and Rick run Democracy Investments, and they operate an exchange-traded fund. The ticker is DMCY, and it licenses the Economist Democracy Index, which we'll talk about in a moment. So Julie, where are you now? What's happening where you are? And because it sounds pretty exciting.
Yeah, so I'm in New York for a week of conferences, actually on a panel on Thursday to talk about the debate within the ESG world. I'll be sitting next to Crane Shares and Strive, so that should be a very interesting discussion. Yes, we heard the news today, as you mentioned, on the missiles trickled into Poland. We're hearing concern about the crypto space, NFTs. Everyone's watching the markets with concern. And yeah, we're really excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to have you. And just so everybody knows, Julie is also a veteran, and so a naval pilot focused on search and rescue. So great to have you leading the cause for democracy. And Rick, where are you?
I'm in Oakland right now.
Okay, great. And so what's the state of democracy today? Is democracy under pressure? Is it durable? And how does that vary worldwide?
Well, I think democracy is under pressure. And what we're losing sight of is that the countries that held us together and got us through the Cold War are, for the most part, shrinking in relative, if not absolute, population. Right? If you look at the United States is the only really big heavyweight democracy on earth. Our near peers are China, India, Indonesia, and Pakistan. Right? That rounds out the top 5 countries. Okay. None of those other countries are going to carry the torch of democracy. You want to go round out the top 10? Nigeria just passed Brazil and is now the 6th largest country on earth. Okay. Then you have Brazil with Bolsonaro, and that is a complicated situation. Bangladesh, Russia, and Mexico. So Mexico has now grown enough, and Russia's per capita GDP has shrunk enough that economically Russia and Mexico are near peers. But in those top 10 countries, we're the only ones that can really carry the torch. If you look at the top 20 countries, you pull in the two Axis powers, or Japan and Germany. And those are the only other two strong democracies in the top 20 countries. And what we see is this massive upsurge of countries from the third world that have been growing like crazy. Nigeria was, I think, below 100 million people in 2000. They're over 200 million now. Ethiopia is soon going to pass Japan in population. Egypt, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they're all surging. And so we have to think about not only protecting democracy today, but our leadership in the rest of the world if we want to lead the rest of the world towards democracy and away from authoritarianism.
All right, so Rick, I think part of your methodology for looking at democracy is the Economist Democracy Index. Is there a slide you wanted to show on that, the latest map?
Please, if you have it up.
Okay, so let me pull that up for us here. And you had mentioned Bolsonaro, but it isn't one of the more recent developments that Lula has won, and isn't that a positive force for democracy?
Absolutely, assuming that Bolsonaro's people actually let that go through. There's been quite a bit of resistance, and we're sort of in the fingers crossed mode right now.
Got it. So yeah, so if for those of you in the audience, if you haven't looked at the top 10 in population like Rick just went through, it's really instructive. And if you haven't tested your geography lately, Nigeria, Pakistan, Ethiopia are all 100 million plus population. So which doesn't always get reflected on the map here. So so Julia, Rick, walk us through what's the color coding here. And I see words like full democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid regimes, and authoritarianism. And the US doesn't look like a full democracy. What's going on?
Oh, we are a flawed democracy. Our score stayed the same last year because we went up, or sorry, our ranking stayed the same last year because we went up in political participation, but we went down in functioning of government. So the spectrum is from 0 to 10. Nobody gets a 0, nobody gets a 10. And these are lines in the sand according to the democracy to kind of group countries according to their democracy country score. And the spectrum is, as you can see, 0 to 10. And there are 60 different indicators that go into each country score. So it's quite a robust process that they conduct every year. And they publish the index at the end of January, which is when we update the tilts in our strategy to shift more capital towards democracies and very neutrally and systematically shift it away from authoritarian states.
Is there a link between quality of life in countries with better rated democracies? I mean, certainly you look at the Nordic countries, Canada and Australia being particularly dark green, and they're all countries where the median person lives pretty well. But how about the rest of the world?
I think there are two effects that you have to separate out. One is, yes, there is definitely a better quality of life with democracy, but also being small really, really helps. I have a separate listing that I call the prominent democracies, which is a way of basically figuring out which democracies are doing extremely well given their size. And the prominent democracies classically have been the US, Japan, Germany, Canada, Sweden, and Norway. And more recently, Taiwan and Finland have slipped in. But if you look at that, Sweden, Norway, Finland, they're all 5 to 10 million people. Canada is kind of a heavy at 40 million. Taiwan has got, I think, 30. None of those are gigantic countries. It's very hard to be a country of a couple 100 million people with multiple ethnic groups and languages and be a good pluralistic democracy. Nigeria is going to be a fascinating challenge. As recently as I think 1999, they were a dictatorship, and they changed their constitution to become a democracy, and promptly elected one of their former dictators, who stood in for 2 terms. and was going to stand in for a third term and sort of destroy the democracy. And Condoleezza Rice really put the screws on him. And then George W. Bush tagged in, and they kept democracy rolling in Nigeria. But they have several hundred different tribes, multitude of languages. It's more than one religion. Nigeria is going to be very, very hard to move in the direction of democracy. And in many ways, it reflects a lot of the problems of India.
So let's just talk about India for a second. Let's talk about India for a second, because it is the world's largest democracy, is it not? And it looks like it rates in the green scale. So what could be working there, at least according to this ratings approach?
They inherited a lot of the infrastructure of a democracy from the Brits, to be honest. Okay. The British are pretty good at going into a country and setting up a lot of institutions. The trick with India is, how is Modi going to behave long term? Sometimes he seems to have authoritarian tendencies. The Hindu nationalist movement is, we're going to have to wait and see on that. So there's a lot that can break either way with India, but it's just very difficult to manage a country of that many cultures and languages. It's enormous. And that's an advantage that China has. China is much more monolithic.
Yeah, one of the things from my travels in India that were fascinating is the number of official languages. So there's a couple dozen official languages. But when you walk down the street, and there's military with machine guns. So when you have a billion-person country, sometimes you need to be able to be ready to help keep it stable. But India, of course, has a lot of innovation, and so. Transitioning a little bit to how this works out economically or from a portfolio, you in your exchange traded fund license the Economist index, and then how do you apply that into an investment index and an investment fund? What are the mechanics of doing that, and how does it tilt?
So we take the Economist country democracy scores and we merge it with an all-world ex-US index. So we look at each large cap, mid cap, developed and emerging markets, each of the securities country of risk, and then just apply the scores that you see on this map. So it very neutrally tilts towards economies of democracies and away from authoritarian states. So all the countries we just talked about, Norway, Sweden, Canada, Taiwan, Japan, UK, we tilt towards those countries, and we tilt away from the UAE, Egypt, China, Saudi Arabia.
Okay. And I guess it has the most major impact on China, maybe, because China is the second largest GDP in the world and has a fair amount of market cap. So yes. Is there a particular number differential that China is underweighted versus a traditional?
Yes, we downweight them by 70%. And we launched just over a year and a half ago and have seen some relative outperformance relative to the market cap only indices, because since we've launched, China has underperformed.
Okay, that seems very timely. So are there, how does this act? Well, is it acting as an incentive yet? There's a famous saying by James Carville from the early Clinton years, "It's the economy, stupid," is his quote. And so this seems to be overlaying that incentive of, well, if you do something, it's not only the economy, it's also the democracy. So what's the correlation between democracy and economic success? Because China has created a very with its structure, a very structured capitalism, state-influenced capitalism, integrated capitalism. The stakeholders in China of any particular investment tend to be the government first. So what is the relationship between economic success and democratic success? And is democracy required to be economically successful?
Well, I think it's a complicated question, in no small part because the China miracle of the last 30 years has really been an example of American nation building. We set out to build China. We set out during the Cold War to create a counterbalance to the Soviet Union in Asia because of just the logic of international strategy. And so we've done that for a very, very long time, and they have outperformed. If you look at the other authoritarian states, they have not. And so one big open question is what's going to happen with China over the next couple of decades as not only the US, but the other democracies start to question the wisdom of disproportionately investing in an authoritarian state of that size. And I think that there will be increasing hesitation. And I think I've said this before, but it's the PE ratio game. If you're a CEO and you've got a high PE ratio, the smart thing to do is to sell cheap shares and go out and buy cheap profits. And your company grows and your shareholders are rewarded. And if you have a low PE ratio, the correct thing to do is to buy back your stock, which also rewards your shareholders, but your company's not expanding. So while we were pumping up China and they had enormous PE ratios, it was cheap for China to grow, quickly. If investment is withdrawn, it will change that dynamic, and China will simply not be able to grow as quickly because as a nation, they'll have a lower PE ratio.
And on top of that, China has a serious demographic problem. They have a huge aging population and not a birth rate to keep up with it because of their previous one-child policy. So some are predicting they could be facing food security issues in the near term as well.
That's a timely, I think Nigel's going to have a question in just 1 second. It's a timely note about population. Today, conceptually at least, is the world is officially 8 billion people. And more than 1 billion people in China, more than 1 billion people in India. Have you looked at not only population size, but population growth or fertility rates in these different democracy categories?
I have. I actually gave a talk about this at the Naval War College almost 10 years ago. Basically, if you look at between now and 2100, the population of the US increases by 150 million, mainly because of immigration. India increases by 250 million, but peaks and is coming back down. Africa increases by 2.4 billion, and the entire rest of the world is net zero. So we don't really have a massive global population growth problem. What we have is a significant disparity between population growth rates in the first world and the third world. And Africa is still growing like gangbusters. So that is really the challenge. The other challenge, and really the difference between when I first did the analysis and today, is the openness of the US to immigration. Will we continue to be this open society that absorbs people from the outside, or will we close ourselves off? Because if we do, that will definitely stymie our growth rate.
Nigel, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I did. I was just going to add to that. In the Earth for All book, which I know we've talked about in a previous discussion, one of the things that's built into the modeling there is what happens to populations taking account of the effects of countries getting richer, there being more spending on education, which has a very strong correlation with birth rates. And just echoing what Rick said, overall at a world level, we don't really have a huge population problem because the population will peak somewhere around 9 billion by 2050. That's materially lower than the UN numbers, but the UN numbers have been forecasting endless growth in population for 50 years, and I still don't think they've got it right, and there's some politics behind why it works that way. But the thing I wanted to draw out from what Julie said was, we often talk about a population problem because it would be easier for China to have more workers if it had more babies and its population was still growing. But that really would be a population problem. Anything which is a growing population in the world is a problem. And the thing we have to navigate is how on earth do we stabilize the population and then get to a point of sustainability? And to link all of this together, the other thing which comes out from the Earth for All work is rising social tension more or less everywhere, driven by declining living standards linked to worse conditions driven by climate change, challenges to do with the food supply chain, increasing polarization of wealth, all sorts of things which go with essentially countries that are being run for the few rather than the many, which is a simple definition in my mind of what a good or a bad democracy might look like. And I think the question I then wanted to ask was, on the one hand, right up front, we talked about wanting to have a big democracy like America to hold the torch for what a good democracy should look like. And on the other hand, saying it's really hard to have a big country that remains thoroughly democratic and the small countries do it well. And here we are in America, where many people have spent the last year or two talking about how American democracy itself is showing all sorts of cracks. I'm fascinated in everybody's views on that without wanting to get too dark so close to the election.
Well, Julie, do you want to talk about this or should I?
Go ahead. Why don't you kick us off?
All right. Well, everybody wants to make us look bad, and we're incredibly good at being self-critical. But I think if you dig under the hood, we have systems that are degenerating that often make us look worse than we are. And then we have external forces that love to come in and drive wedges between every conceivable population. And because we have so many of those populations, it's easy to do. For starters, people talk about political polarization in the US. And when you really look at it, these are rough numbers, right? But we're about a third Republican, a third Independent, a third Democrat. And with our primary system, that means that the median nominated Republican is going to be to the right of 5/6 of the population. The median Democrat who's nominated is going to be to the left of 5/6 of the population. I just switched up my hands, by the way. And really that polarizes them, because if you sort of, from stats class, the 68, 95, 99.7 rule describing standard deviations. Well, basically what I just described is a scenario where the median Republican is one standard deviation to the right of the population, and the average Democrat is one who's nominated is one standard deviation to the left. And so our nominated officials and then elected officials are highly polarized, while our people actually aren't. We say that a red state might be 55-45 and a blue state might be, flip the other direction. That's 90% the same. So we have that as a problem. And that's more about our elected officials than our people. We also have a degenerate system with the Electoral College, which incentivizes candidates to go and campaign in small states because it's winner take all. The downside is the states they have no chance of winning in, they don't bother campaigning in. And those states are states like California and Texas and New York. No presidential candidate has meaningfully campaigned in any of those states after they were nominated in decades. Right? The biggest states in the country have not had a presidential candidate who's nominated trying to win votes in them for decades. That's bad, but that doesn't say anything bad about our people. It says that we have a system that needs some work. But if you don't have some big democracies to carry the torch, when a country like Russia rolls into Ukraine, it's hard to kind of glue together the democracies and into a coalition when Russia could just as easily assemble their own. So I think that the world still needs us. I don't think we're in as bad a shape as we think we are, but I think that our political institutions need to be tweaked. And the hardest part of that is that the people who are in power are the ones who have the incentive to not tweak those institutions, because tweaking them might require us to kind of get rid of some of those guys.
Well, there has been some positive progress on that front. There is progress towards the Electoral College Act. There is progress. The good news about democracy under pressure is it's a little less under pressure, as in the US, the battleground states did not elect election deniers for secretaries of state. So that's another relieving of a little bit of pressure. So question from the audience. When we had the map up, somebody very astutely said, it looked like Uruguay is categorized as a full democracy in a continent full of some flawed democracies. What's working? Is it a small country? Is it a small population issue? And then Dr. Fadhel Kaboub is here as well. And I know, Fadhel, you've spent a lot of time in Africa recently, so it'd be good to get your perspective on global democracy and in Africa. But what's happening in Latin America?
I'm gonna have to look that one up. Give me a few minutes.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
while he's looking that up, I'd like to go back to the polarization discussion just for a minute and my concern about the increase in disinformation, polarizing not just our country, but the tools out there and the companies that are not being held accountable. Rick found some research a while back that the #1 source of Black Lives Matter tweets, social media, was that Pakistan, Rick? I believe it was.
Wait, what?
The Black Lives Matter, the #1 source of tweets and social media was from.
I don't remember this. There was something brief. It wasn't #1 by any means. There was a brief window when there was something which is an anomaly, but I don't remember what it was. But certainly the vast majority of BLM tweets are completely legitimate. The bigger problem, though, is that Russia in particular has come in and fanned the flames by pushing sometimes extreme members of either the BLM people or the anti-BLM people, the white supremacists, or other times pushing them to co-locate in a manner that's going to cause violence, right? They've done that, and yeah, there was, it's been a couple of years, but there was something where there was a troll farm out of some country that was doing something, but I forgot what that was. But it's more about really external people, external actors trying to break up the democracies. If you, in so many of the movements that they target are legitimate, right? Brexit, totally legitimate. Scottish exit, totally legitimate. Catalonian exit, totally legitimate. Texas exit, totally legitimate. California exit, I didn't believe that one for a second. The guy was on a plane to Moscow 24 hours later, right? But in every single one of those cases, Russia's been backing it because Russia wants to break up the democracies.
Understand. All right, Dr. Fadhel.
Very interesting
have a frontline
discussion.
view in many countries around the world. So tell us your
I
perspective.
actually wanted to follow a thread that came up in the discussion a few minutes ago about climate change. I'm going to go ahead and share screen here for a second. This is from a World Bank report that the World Bank produced a couple of times. The latest version of the report came out last year. The report is called Groundswell, and it's referring to climate-induced migration and movements of people within countries. And just to be clear, this is not cross-border movements. And this is for 2050. The estimates that they have in the report is for 2040 and 2050. The numbers are scary, to be honest. And the African continent is on the front lines of climate change and of mass movement of people. Some of this is already happening as we speak. So I wanted to go back to a couple of the comments that were made by Rick and Nigel about climate change. The amount of stress that countries and democracies in particular will face, not only on the continent, but a lot of this will be movement to Europe, movement to other countries in the global north. Are those countries prepared economically with infrastructure to deal with mass movements of people? When we see even half of this estimate, even if half of this estimate is true, how does that impact the resilience of democracies? And then my other comment or thought I wanted to share here, especially when it comes to the African continent in particular, as it relates to democracy, one of the kind of statements that I often say when I think about economic development in on the African continent in particular is you can't truly democratize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet. And I say it in reference also to climate change. You can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet. And I say this as somebody who grew up under a dictatorship regime in Tunisia and observed the Tunisian post-revolution democracy struggle economically, and then devolve into yet another form of dictatorship for the last year and a half, pretty much. So these are the thoughts I wanted to share. I wanted to get reactions from our guests on the climate impact, stressing democracies even more, and on the issue of, can we truly democratize a system if it's still being colonized economically, steered from abroad, reliant excessively on extractive industries, and we know the influence of extractive industries, especially in the African continent. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating question, and the challenges come up within countries where we start to see, even in rich places like Australia, significant floods which displace a significant number of people, and actually government promises support and then none is given, and 3 or 4 years later they're still living with the pain. And that's in a country that can well afford to deal with things. To the point about Africa, I was looking at South Sudan this last weekend, and there you have an economy that has 80% plus of its GDP from fossil fuels, a continued pressure to expand those fossil fuel development there, when at the same time you've got a country that is where people suffer, like something like 7 or 8 million people are expected to have significant food shortages in the year ahead because of a combination of floods and droughts. And the whole thing is just it seems like a complete disaster. And how much did I know about that 3 days ago? None at all, because all of these problems swirl around the world, and they're very, very, very difficult for anybody to focus on them if they're not their own problem.
So Julie, sounds like you have a panel this week of woke versus anti-woke, ESG versus anti-ESG. Maybe it's democracy versus non-democracy. Fadhel brought up climate action. So how does that work into democracy?
I think we should call it woke versus smoke, by the way.
Oh, I like that. Oh, I might have to steal that, Nigel.
Please steal it. I've been trying to find that for our whole year. There it is. It's just come.
Nigel is the best with coming up with titles.
Well, so we like to look at ourselves as the big G for government in ESG, or where is the D in ESG? And yes, I'll be sitting next to some folks, some other companies that are very focused on the E. However, they are not taking into account wind farms and solar panels are being created by forced labor, which the US has labeled as genocide, and it continues to go on. So how can you, I've always said, how can you claim to be ESG if you're not taking into account human rights and you're so laser focused on the E? So yeah, there's a lot of interesting, I don't want to call it hypocrisy, but it's lack of transparency, lack of not looking at the big picture. And that's why, while we are not technically an ESG strategy, we score well in the ESG with various ESG rating agencies, because democracies tend to be more ESG focused to begin with. So for example, we are exposed in the energy sector the same amount as a typical all world ex-US passive index strategy. However, our oil and gas companies were downweighting Saudi Arabia, and we're overweighting Norway and Canada.
Yeah, and I don't know if Democracy Investments has looked at like the greenhouse gas intensity yet. It would seem to be a mix, since US and Canada are big, but also Emirates, but also China. So it'd be interesting to hear how climate action may progress faster.
Yep. Agreed.
By the way, I have the Uruguay numbers.
Okay.
Didn't want to leave
Yeah.
whoever asked that out. That actually is really interesting. They swept through the categories and did, because there's 60 different parameters, and a lot of it's about the infrastructure of a democracy. They only got 1 0 in the whole list. And that 0 was for voter turnout, which is arguably the most important one. Excuse me, most important one. That's why I'm drinking chamomile, by the way, is because my throat's going. But yeah, they're struggling to keep voter turnout over 50%, which is interesting. And they get partial scores for voter engagement. I'm not sure that it's interesting, but they have all the infrastructure and they're not suppressing the vote or doing anything. They're not torturing people. So yeah, just maybe there's a little bit of voter apathy down there, but other than that, they're doing pretty well.
Well, could it be, and again, you're just looking at the score, so maybe we don't have the direct view, but could it be that things are going well and voter participation is low when things go well? Because voter participation certainly spiked in the last 6 years when there was a threat to things not going well. Is that a contributing factor? Like, how do you maintain engagement in high quality of life areas?
I think that can be a real thing. And I think that one reason why we think that we're polarized is that all the easy issues get settled early on in a democracy, right? Like, oh, should we ban murder? Yeah, that passed with 99% of the vote. Like, we're geniuses. You wait 250 years and, we're really close to being 250 years since 1776. After 250 years, you've got a bunch of people sitting around in Congress like, oh, we should write a bill about something. What's left? And you find that there's a lot of issues left. They're just kind of deadlocks that are unresolved, may never be resolved. And that's all people have to work on. So you have one of two ways. One is you get people who are elected like, everything's great, let's do nothing. Or nobody wants to run for office unless they care a huge amount about something that nobody else cares about, or else something is divided. And then you end up with, highly, stratified politicians. So it could be, it could simply be that Uruguay is doing a good job.
Great. Yeah, and I saw that Venezuela was red in Latin America as well. Do you know anything about Cambodia? So linking the labor participation rate as the introduction to this, and knowing that they went through, a terrible genocide for a decade or two. What's happening in Southeast Asia, and is that so you can see some greenish in Thailand, as well as Singapore maybe lighting up at the bottom there, as well as some parts of Indonesia. So what factors maybe do we need to keep in mind wherever this happens, and how can investors apply this? Like, how can investors, do we just reduce risk, or is there some way to create leverage or an incentive for countries or companies to exert influence over countries even?
Well, I think what you're seeing in Cambodia is that they're just really poor. They've got something like a $1,500 per capita GDP. So I don't know that it's viable for as many people to drop out of the workforce and still eat. I once gave an oceanographic series of presentations in Indonesia, and I would just show random people all the pictures of the fish that were offshore in Indonesia. And the question would always come back, and how would you cook them? Because it turns out that when people are hungry, that sort of dominates their way of thinking. And so I think you may have a high labor participation rate in Cambodia because people are hungry and they got to eat.
Okay, I understand. Nigel, you want to drift over to Africa? And Fadhel, do you have a particular view on how democracies are progressing or receding?
I actually have a question for Julie and Rick. So the clients who are interested in this data and this information, they're trying to invest responsibly. They're trying to think about, investing in places that don't use child labor, have, thriving democracies or making progress. But also, do you get the clients who are actively trying to divest from particular places because of things they heard in the news or reports about, the kind of goods and services they buy here in the U.S. or in the global North have a suspicious supply chain track record, and they want to trace them to particular companies or countries? How much of that do you see from clients who are interested in this kind of data?
Yeah, we see a lot of that actually, and from both sides. And because we're using the securities country of risk to categorize them in our system, we're pretty much capturing holistically as best we can in a very neutral, cheap, passive way of doing business. But yeah, more and more, especially with the younger generations, I would say, people want to vote with their dollars. No, it's no longer the old school way of what are the returns. People are worried about everything we've talked about today. It's becoming more and more front of mind. And I would say, especially with the millennials and Gen Z, I mean, they're not just worried, they're mad at the world they're inheriting, and they want to make sure their dollars are having impact for better.
And yet they still don't vote. So we had record turnout amongst the under 30 category this time in the US election, much trumpeted as being very exciting. And the turnout was 27%, which is, I think that's the number in the US, which just amazes me. And I tell all young people, you should get out and get very active and go and push out all the old people, because the old people got free education and final salary pension schemes. And guess what? You guys don't, but still they don't vote. And I don't understand why that is. I wish I did. You may be able to tell us, Rick or Julie.
I think voting is, so this is a weird thing, but I've noticed, California's trying to transition everyone to mail-in ballots. And honestly, they pulled out all the mailboxes. It's hard to vote. You got to find a mailbox now. You got to drive all over town looking for a mailbox. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but that's a really weird phenomenon. It's probably not the whole thing. Why people don't vote, a lot of people just don't learn about it, I guess. They're also, frankly, the old way was a ritual, right? There was a ritual aspect to voting. I'm questioning a little bit whether vote by mail destroys the ritual and whether the ritual itself has value.
Well,
Yeah,
I will say, as a vote by
is a
mail,
small.
I will say, as a proponent of vote by mail, is that it gives you time to review what you're going to vote for. That may not always happen if you just show up. Also, I'm from Chicago, where historically you pull one lever to pull for all the Democrats. And in Chicago, you might pull it more than once. So yeah, education and is super important. It could be that this is the beginning of a trend with being connected and being on social media, that more information or more peer pressure could help increase youth participation. All right, we're getting close to the end of our hour. So Julie or Rick, are there things we haven't yet covered about democracy durability and how it affects portfolios and capital flows?
Well, we're starting to see more and more research that demonstrates democracies are less risky and can outperform authoritarians over time. So looking forward to seeing more data on that regard. I would encourage everyone to read the Economist Democracy Index. There's a lot of really interesting trends in there. And be more aware of what's in your passive. If you're investing passively in a huge index fund, you really need to do your homework, read your prospectus, and understand what you're investing in, because you may be supporting something not aligned with your values.
Yeah, and I put in the Zoom chat link, or you can research it yourself. You can start at Wikipedia to read, see the ratings and rankings over time of countries grouped by continent and grouped by the categories of democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid regimes, authoritarian. So check that out.
And you can link directly to the Economist Democracy Index from our website, which is www.democracyinvestments.com. But this is a great summary in Wikipedia if you don't want to download the huge report.
We have readers and we have scanners. Great. And then Rick, anything else we should remember before we wrap up about the durability and resilience, but also fragility of democracy?
Well, when we were analyzing the invasion of Ukraine early on, one of our concerns was it was really as much about pushing refugees out of Ukraine to destabilize democracies in Europe as it was about taking territory. The refugee crises from Iraq, Syria, et cetera, Afghanistan, had been destabilizing and helped promote authoritarians and nationalists that were rising in Europe. And it seemed like almost as a dry run before the invasion, the Belarusians were stacking refugees on the border with Poland about a year ago in November. If you look at the Carpathian Mountains, all the refugees are going to flow to Poland anyway. So when we talk about how countries are going to respond to climate change and the migration that's induced by that, that migration could very well destabilize democracies and likewise empower nationalist movements that are anti-refugee. And to the extent that countries can resist that and can maintain an open and honest stance, often because they're democratic, I think that not only will they handle climate change better, but by being more inclusive and incorporating more people into their economies, ultimately they will see outsized growth and they will see outsized population growth, all of which will be good for your portfolio. So I think that investing in democracy in the long run, even with the circumstances of climate change, is still, I think, a sound investment.
Great. All right. Well, I want to thank Julie Kane and Rick Rakowski of Democracy Investments. If you want to learn more, go to democracyinvestments.com, which includes their exchange-traded fund. I want to thank Dr. Fadhel Kaboub of the Denison University and Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, as well as Amir Khaleghi, hopefully soon, PhD next year. From the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a hip investor analyst. Our producer, Nick Gower, who helps make all of this possible, and my co-host, Nigel Lake in New York. I'm Paul Herman here in France. Next month, we're going to cover a COP27 debrief with our December Green Jobs Report. So please join us for ESGX next time. Nigel, any summary before we break?
I think the last word for me is simply that action on everything around climate and environment is really popular with ordinary people across the whole OECD. As part of the Earth for All work, we did a big survey, and it's a very broad and election-winning set of topics. So politicians that are out there wondering how to get elected, act on these things and act on them in a way which is good for everybody, not just a few, and you will win your elections. It's quite attractive. And this reinforces the message then of democracy being good for investments, because those environments are promoting significant investment in all of these things as well. So I think that's an exciting and positive story against what's a topic which is a fairly dark one in many ways.
Well said,
Thank
Nigel.
you, everyone. Thank you for listening, and please share ESGX with your communities and audience. We have more than 75 episodes about the health, wealth, earth, equality, and trust of society and how that connects to portfolio risk, return, and impact. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting us, Paul and Nigel.